Should you tip your Uber or Lyft driver? My name is Chris and welcome to the RideShare Guy. Now, tipping is not all over the world, but in the US, it is very customary, especially in the service industry. So people like your waiters and waitresses, your bar staff at restaurants, they usually get tipped. Your hairstylist, people who are in the service industry who are on the front line or dealing directly with the customer. And yes, that includes taxi drivers. So let's go over, should you tip your Uber or Lyft driver? And after we answer that, it's going to actually bring up two more questions that we're going to answer as well too. There was an article recently just posted and we're going to go over that. We're going to kind of react to it and share some things. I'll leave a link to the description below if you want to read the article in its entirety. And then also we're going to end on what some of you had to say when we posed the question on our YouTube community tab. So let's get right into it. Should you tip your drivers? And the answer is yes. It's been customary to tip your taxi cab driver for several years, and Uber and Lyft drivers are no different. They're just doing it under a different name, and then they're also doing it with their vehicle. And then why are we even having this conversation? And that is because Uber actually set it up originally that drivers could not be tipped. The whole process was supposed to be frictionless, meaning you would put your card on file, you would order your ride, and then you would get picked up and dropped off depending on where your pickup and drop-off locations were. Frictionless, seamless, cashless. And of course, tips were not included there. Then in 2017, Uber had changed their stance and started allowing for tipping on the platform. And so you can see how this could create some confusion between passengers tipping their drivers or not. So for several years, it didn't allow tipping on the platform, but then all of a sudden it changed its stance. Now, Lyft, on the other hand, did take a difference of stance when it came to tipping drivers, and they have allowed it. But let's go to an article that we're going to reference now. So this article is from Reader's Digest, and it's titled, "Do You Need to Tip Uber Drivers?" Yes. Yes, you do. Rideshare tipping explained. An Uber ride will likely be much nicer and more convenient than a traditional cab, but should you tip your driver? And will your decision affect your passenger rating? Catching an Uber, Lyft, or other rideshare is a great way to get from point A to point B. It's affordable, super convenient, and just like a taxi, except not exactly. Which raises the question, if you tip taxi drivers, do you tip Uber drivers? And if so, how much should you tip? Should you tip more depending on the type of car they drive or amenities they offer? And how should you give the tip to the driver? An Uber driver says, "I would never say I expect a tip. It is always optional," she says, "but I will say that the majority of people do tip and always appreciate because it is a big part of the income." Now, I don't know where she is specifically or if that area is just more prone to having good tippers, but in actuality, the average person doesn't tip their drivers. And it can be a real problem because maybe 2 out of 10 rides actually will tip their drivers. Now, that percentage could be higher based on the driver, based on the area, and some other factors. But most drivers that I talk to, it really is only about 20 to 30%. Now that we got that you should be tipping your Uber and Lyft drivers, the question is, how much? Similar to tipping for other services like getting a massage or going to the nail salon, the rule of thumb is to tip 20%. So if your ride costs $30, an average cost for a moderate trip in most cities, then you'll tip $6 for a total of $36. If the trip is short and the fare is low, don't tip less than $2, even if that's more than 20%. And should you tip your drivers more in certain circumstances? Goes on and says, yeah, you should consider a 25% tip if the driver helps you with bags or luggage, the ride is unusually long, you require special accommodations, you need to make a stop, you have a low passenger rating, they can choose not to accept your ride, and many people do not accept rides if a passenger rating is too low. And then also you requested a nicer car or higher tier driver. That would include something like Uber Comfort, XL, Black, Lux, whatever it might be. So another question you might have is, what is the best way to tip a driver? Well, you can always do it through the app after the ride is complete, and it's still frictionless and cashless, or you could do cash, because we all know cash is king. And then you also might be wondering, do drivers know if you tip or not? Absolutely we do. We know, trust me. And those who say, oh, I'll tip you in the app, guaranteed that 90% of the time, you will not tip in the app. and we know that. Now, another question you might have is, should you tip a driver who has been rude? And the answer is, yeah, you should still tip all of your drivers for every ride, even if they're rude. And the answer is because everybody's allowed to have a bad day, and you have no idea who was just getting out of the back seat before you got in the back seat. And if you worked in the service industry, you know you could face a horrible passenger and could have just before you. So that tip will not only help them kind of forget that passenger beforehand, maybe put a smile on their face, but in the long run, it actually helps them earn more so they can do more of what they'd rather do. All right, so let's take a look at some of the comments that we had posted on our YouTube community tab and what you had to say. All right, so first comment, Jonathan Gale. I can guarantee if the passenger tips most of the time, it would improve service for everyone. Getting tipped always gives me a moral boost, so I can imagine the average driver would feel the same. And I would have to agree. After seeing a tip come through, it's always nice, it's always appreciated. And if there were more than, the 20, 30, 40% of rides that we're tipping, it would definitely be a lot better. Now, Malcolm says, I look at it this way. I've been doing this for the last 7.5 years, and 2 things have learned from doing this. A, I'm not getting a 5-star rating every time, let alone a rating period, and I am not expecting to get tipped every single time. As long as the rider's from point A to point B quickly, effective, and safe, everything else will take care of itself. Actions speak louder than words. Now, Michael says, rideshare companies should either give drivers a larger portion of the total fare or let drivers set their own rates and take a consistent percentage each time. Drivers should not have to rely on tips to break even or profit, and riders should not feel pressure to tip large amounts when their rides can already be expensive. That being said, I always tip service workers as long as my experience wasn't horrendous. M. Stonewall says, I think so, but maybe that's just because I've always known that you have to tip your taxi driver. Maybe tipping for taxis has problems at its root that I'm not aware of. Steven says, if you don't tip, then you have no business going to a restaurant or using a rideshare. Both are very low-paying gigs, and tips are what helps keep us alive. Pet Lovers says passengers don't have to tip after every ride because tips are optional. The huge problem is that the passengers are getting overcharged most of the time and drivers are underpaid, meaning our tips are getting stolen by Uber by overcharging the passenger. One example, I had a ride from downtown Denver to the airport. Customer paid $102 and Uber paid the driver $35. How can I expect a tip from the customer at that price? And if you want to see some more of the comments, well, head over to the community tab and check out the post. So the key takeaway is, yes, you should be tipping your drivers at least 20% on every ride, sometimes more depending on the ride. And of course, don't go lower than $2 if it's a short ride. And trust me, that's not coming from an Uber or Lyft driver. That's coming from a tipping expert. But I will agree with that. And I want to know what your thoughts are. So make sure you put them in the comments and let us know. Now, if you're wondering what goes into the pricing structure, well, check out this video right here as we talk about that with Sergio and myself from a live show that we do every Tuesday. And make sure you subscribe and ring the bell for notifications so you won't miss anything. We'll see you in the next one.